Today, we're going to look at one of the most unbelievable revenge stories I've ever come across, but you won't even know that it's a revenge story until the very end. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So, if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button is out of town, secretly bug their house with cameras and microphones, and then live stream those feeds on the billboards in Times Square, New York. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. In the early evening of May 7th, 2008, a 65-year-old woman named Zivana Temolkoska walked around her kitchen inside of her apartment in the little southeastern European city of Kisevo. Kisevo is a quiet place at the base of this huge mountain in northern Macedonia, and while it's totally beautiful, it's utterly remote, and basically nothing really of note happens here. Zivana cleaned houses for a living, but on this particular day, she was on a day off, and so she was just kind of hanging out at her apartment, waiting for her adult son, named Zoran, to come home. It was a beautiful, warm evening that night, and so Zivana had the windows in the kitchen open as she walked around making herself something to eat, and at some point, as she was doing this, she heard her phone ring, and so she grabbed it and answered, and she heard the sound of her friend on the other line. But her friend's voice sounded strange. It was strained and very uncomfortable, and she was asking Zivana if she was paying attention to the news right now. Did she have the radio on or the TV? And Zivana was like, no, why? And the friend would tell her that all over the news right now, there was this huge, terrible traffic accident that had happened in their town, and unfortunately, Zivana's son, Zoran, who she was waiting for to come home, was apparently involved in this accident. Zivana let out a strangled cry when she heard this, and then just dropped what she was using to make food and turned and ran out the door. And when she did, her neighbor who was outside saw her emerge and yelled out to her, hey, is everything okay? And Zivana, as she literally just continued running towards the road, she basically blurted out to the neighbor that her son was hurt and she was going to the hospital. And this neighbor watched as Zivana just ran down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared. Zivana did not have a car of her own, and so literally she was going to run to the hospital to make sure her son was okay. A little while later, that same neighbor who had just watched Zivana disappear around the corner heard a knock on their door. And so the neighbor went to the door, they opened it up, and they were totally shocked at who they saw standing outside. It was Zivana's son, Zoran, who did not appear to be hurt in any way. But before the neighbor could ask any questions about this, Zoran, who looked visibly confused, said to the neighbor, hey, have you seen my mom? We were supposed to meet and have dinner together, and it's just totally unlike her to disappear without telling me where she was going. The neighbor just stared at Zoran for a second, having no idea what was going on here, and then the neighbor was like, well, wait a minute, Zoran, were you in a car accident? And Zoran's like, no, what are you talking about? And then the neighbor kind of filled Zoran in about how they had seen his mother run outside, and she had mentioned how her son had been in this car accident, and she literally ran to the hospital. Zoran was just as mystified by this as the neighbor was, and so Zoran just grabbed his phone and called the hospital to see if his mother was there. But when the hospital picked up, they would tell Zoran that his mother was not there, she had not been there all day, and two, even though they had heard reports about this car accident in town, there had not been any car accident victims brought to the hospital at all that day. And so by the end of that night, when Zoran really had no idea what had happened to his mom, where she was, or what was going on with this car accident thing, he just did the only thing he could think to do, which was go to the police and report his mother missing. 9 days later, on May 16th, when still Zivana was missing and the police had no idea what happened to her, there were no new leads, nothing, on this day, a 56-year-old reporter named Vlado Teneski, who actually happened to live not that far away from where Zivana lived, he got a call from one of his police sources. And the source would tell him that Zivana had actually just been found, even though this was not public information, and unfortunately, Zivana was dead. Her body, which had been beaten and strangled and stabbed, had been found wrapped up in plastic and dumped in this illegal dumping area not far from the town's football stadium. The source told Vlado that when her body was searched, they discovered she still had valuables on her person, and so that kind of ruled out the possibility that this was a robbery gone wrong, which was the initial theory about what they were seeing. However, when police had done an initial probe into Zavana's life to figure out who this victim was, they discovered that she was just this poor old cleaning lady who had no enemies to speak of, and so it really just made no sense that she was the victim of such an obviously brutal and intimate murder that was not financially motivated, at least not on the surface. Vlado thanked his source for all the information and then hung up. Vlado's source had sounded really shocked by this murder as he was telling Vlado, but now, as Vlado was sitting here thinking about what he had just been told, he wasn't really shocked as much as he was suspicious. He felt like something just was off about this murder. Maybe Zavana appeared to be this poor old cleaning lady with no enemies, but in reality, maybe that wasn't who she was. Maybe she was leading a secret life that got her killed. Or maybe she had stumbled upon something she was not supposed to see and that got her killed. Vlado had no idea, but he just felt like, there's something off about this and it needs to be investigated. Now, Vlado had a reputation in town for being this very aggressive and kind of fearless journalist who had no problem diving headfirst into some of these really murky stories that could involve corruption or misuse of power, and he would get to the bottom of it, and he would publish these articles where he spoke really critically about the government, about police, about anybody really who was in a position of power. But as a result of conducting himself this way, over his 30-year career, Vlado had been threatened with violence many, many times for things he had written or things he was about to write. But even though Vlado knew this Zavana murder case had the potential to once again put him in hot water with the powers that be, he still felt like it was his responsibility to dive into this thing and get to the truth. So, feeling determined, Vlado grabbed his notebook and pen, and he walked out the front door of his house, and he made the several-minute-long walk over to Zavana's house. And when he got there, her son, Zoran, opened the door, and a few minutes later, Vlado and Zoran were sitting in the kitchen talking about what had happened. Zoran told Vlado all about how he came home and discovered his mom wasn't there, and then he went to the neighbor's house, and they explained how, they had seen Zavana running off to the hospital to go look for Zoran, but Zoran's like, I'm not hurt, I didn't get into a car accident, what's going on here? And as Zoran spoke, Vlado took lots of notes and asked lots of follow-up questions, and by the end of this interview, when Vlado felt like he knew everything there was to know about Zavana, he felt like he actually had a pretty good working theory as to what actually happened to Zavana. And the reason he felt like his theory could be accurate had to do with what Zoran told Vlado his mother did for a living, that she was a cleaning lady. Now, it took Vlado a couple of days to put together his story. He had to go out and interview dozens more people in the neighborhood. But finally, on May 19th, so just 3 days after Zavana was found murdered, Vlado published his story in the newspaper. And the story's explosive headline read, "A Serial Killer Stalks Kosovo." Did you know that this YouTube channel is not the only place where we post strange, dark, and mysterious content? No, we also have the Mrballen podcast, which has over 180 episodes, all strange, dark, and mysterious, that are available to listen to right now on Amazon Music. And at least half of them are completely exclusive to the podcast, which means you cannot get those stories unless you listen on the podcast. But that's not all. In addition to the Mrballen podcast, we also have Mrballen's Medical Mysteries podcast, which, you guessed it, covers medical mysteries. They're all strange, dark, and mysterious, but medical is the focus. And that podcast is available on all podcast platforms, but if you listen on Amazon Music, you can get batches of 8 episodes that get released in seasons. On all other podcast platforms, it's 1 episode a week, but Amazon Music, it's like a binge. So again, in addition to this YouTube channel, there are 2 other places, Mrballen Podcast and Mrballen's Medical Mysteries, where you can find more new, original, strange, dark, and mysterious content. Go check them out. In the story, Vlado says that Zavana's murder was very likely not an isolated killing. Instead, her murder was likely linked to 2 other murders of 2 other women. And these 2 other victims looked an awful lot like Zavana, literally. They were poor, older women who were also cleaning ladies. And so that was why when Vlado was talking to Zoran, and Zoran described how his mother was, what she did for work, what she looked like, that Vlado started to remember these other victims, and he put it all together. The other two victims were 64-year-old Mitra Simjanoska, who was murdered in 2005, and the other victim was 56-year-old Lubica Lukoska, who was murdered in 2007. Now, Vlado's story was totally explosive because what he's saying is that there is a serial killer that is on the loose in this town. But this story was also highly explosive because Vlado spoke very critically about the police who were involved in this investigation. Specifically, he pointed out that the 05 and 07 murders of those two other women, those had been totally mishandled because arrests had been made in at least one of those cases, and clearly whoever they arrested was innocent here. And so the police just totally dropped the ball, at least in Vlado's opinion. And when the police read Vlado's story, they were very upset at him because he was so critical of them. However, the police also did see that Vlado had managed to uncover a lot of new details from all of his interviews with witnesses and people in the neighborhood that did seem to paint a picture of this potentially really being a serial killer, not individual isolated killings. And so the police, based on Vlado's story, would actually begin investigating a serial killer in their midst. They linked all three murders and they began basically a new investigation. However, at the same time they began this new investigation, Vlado began to notice that he was being tailed all the time by police. He would be out in town doing his job, reporting and interviewing people, and there'd just be a police officer standing somewhere in the distance watching him. But Vlado had anticipated that no matter what, he was likely going to face some sort of blowback from the police, and so he just kind of accepted that they were going to watch him and maybe try to intimidate him, but it wasn't going to bother him because he had done his job, he had reported the story the best that he could, and if they wanted to watch him from a distance, they could do that. By early June, so about 2 weeks after Zavana had been found murdered, the police, in this new serial killer investigation they were doing, had narrowed down their suspect pool, which was in the hundreds, down to just 3 people, and they felt like they were very close to making an arrest. About a month later, on June 20th, so by this point Vlado is still being trailed by police all the time, but the police have not come out publicly and said anything about the serial killer case. They're just continuing their investigation. But on this day, June 20th, Vlado's editor at the newspaper got a call from a police officer telling the editor they were about to make an arrest in the serial killer case. And as soon as their conversation ended, the editor called Vlado to tell him the news. But when he called Vlado, Vlado didn't pick up, which was very unusual. Vlado always answered his calls. And the editor was also thinking to himself how strange it was that this officer had contacted him and not Vlado. Like, why aren't you going to the guy writing the stories and telling him about this new development? Why are you coming to me? The editor would continue to try calling Vlado several more times, but Vlado never answered. And so ultimately, the editor just kind of assumed that Vlado must be busy, interviewing someone, or maybe more likely, he had already learned about this imminent arrest, and he was on scene, ready to capture in real time this arrest that was about to take place. Meanwhile, on a quiet street in Kosovo, the police had surrounded this very modest 2-story home that was very overgrown up front. It was surrounded by tall fir trees, and all the windows had heavy drapes covering them up. And then once the police felt like they had totally surrounded this building, a team of officers walked up onto the porch and knocked on the door and yelled out that they were police and whoever was inside to come out with their hands up. And for a moment, it was just totally silent and tense. And then the police on the porch heard footsteps inside the house. They had their guns ready to go, and then the door slowly opened up, and this man, who seemed very unthreatening and kind of confused, stepped out onto the porch, and the police immediately arrested him and took him away. A few minutes later, back at the newspaper headquarters, Vlado's editor got another phone call. And when he answered, it was the same police officer who had called before to warn him about this upcoming arrest. Except this time, the officer was calling to say the arrest had been made, they had caught their serial killer, and then he told the editor the name of the person they arrested. And when the editor heard the name, he dropped the phone in shock. The serial killer was Vlado. It would turn out that Vlado appeared very professional and calm on the outside, but inside, he was full of rage, specifically at his mother, who he viewed as this terrible, cruel person. And after she died in 2002, Vlado became obsessed with this idea of getting revenge on his deceased mother. And the way he decided he would do that would be by killing random women who just kind of looked and seemed an awful lot like his mother, i.e., they were poor, older, and cleaning ladies. His 3 victims, Mitra in 2005, Lubitsa in 2007, and Zvana in 2008, had all personally known Vlado's mother. And so Vlado had actually used that connection to gain each of his victims' trust, and then once he had their trust, he would lure them away to strangle, stab, and beat them to death. In Vlado's explosive newspaper story, he lied about a whole bunch of things just to throw the police off. Like, for example, he made up that he spoke to a witness who claimed to have seen Zvana get into a car with 2 men right before she vanished. Vlado did not see that. That was just a total lie designed to confuse the police. Vlado had also been the one to plant that story on the radio about Zvana's son, Zoran, being in this terrible accident. That had caused Zvana to run out of her house and be vulnerable to be scooped up and killed, which is exactly what Vlado wanted. He had called the radio station and told them about this accident, and because he had previously worked for that radio station, they believed him without doing any fact-checking and broadcast the story. And so really that whole radio broadcast was just a very intentional trap by Vlado to kill Zvana. But what ultimately got Vlado caught was in the article he wrote, he left in some really specific details that the police had not revealed to the public. And so basically by including these in the story, it meant Vlado had an inside scoop into what was really going on. Like, for example, Vlado said that all 3 of these women who had been killed by the serial killer had been strangled to death by telephone cords that were left at the scene. But again, the police had not revealed that to the public, and so when they read the story, they actually became very suspicious of Vlado and thought he could be involved in these murders. And so when Vlado felt like the police were trailing him just to intimidate him, in reality, the police were trailing Vlado because they thought he could be the murderer, and eventually, when they got a DNA sample from Vlado, it was confirmed that their suspicions were right. He was the killer. After Vlado's arrest, he was immediately charged with 2 of the 3 murders, and the police were getting ready to charge him with the 3rd, and they were even looking at a 4th victim, potentially, that maybe Vlado had killed as well, but they weren't entirely sure yet. But on June 23rd, so just 3 days after Vlado's arrest, he died in jail in a way that really didn't make any sense. Vlado had drowned in a small bucket of water inside of his jail cell while there were 3 other people inside of that jail cell with him who all said they didn't notice it happening. Officially, Vlado's death was ruled a suicide, and after his death, all of the murder investigations were closed. It's no secret that many of the stories I cover involve people attacking other people or even killing other people, and I just need you to know that I do not take that lightly. The people in these stories are real. They had real families and friends. They had jobs, careers, ambitions, goals, good days, bad days. I mean, they were just like us. But unfortunately, the way the media often portrays violent crime is the focus of the news coverage is on the perpetrator or perpetrators and not on the actual victim or victims or their families. When the news coverage fades about the crime, the victim and their families are just kind of forgotten about, until now. The Mrballen Foundation, which was founded in 2022, exists solely to honor and support victims of violent crime as well as their families. And because the operational expenses of the Mrballen Foundation are funded entirely by Ballen Studios, it means charitable donations that come into the foundation go 100% to the cause. Not 99%, not 98%, 100%. Your money that comes in, it goes right out the door to the cause. And this year, in 2023 alone, with your help, we raised $763,420. And that money was given directly to victims of violent crime, as well as their families. And also portions of that money were also given to reputable, established charitable organizations that are out there right now, making a real difference for these forgotten people that we're trying to help. If you want to get involved, involved, go to mrballen.foundation and click on the tab at the top of the screen that says Get Involved. Most people join the Honor Them Society, which you can learn about on the Get Involved tab, because in addition to supporting the cause, that tier of giving also affords you perks like exclusive access to special live events with me. So again, the website is mrballen.foundation and just click on Get Involved. Thank you so much to all of our donors, our supporters, and of course the fans of the strange, dark, and mysterious. Without all of you, none of this would be possible. By most people's standards, Susan Monica's life had been pretty good. She had a small but very close group of friends, she had a great job working as an engineer, and she lived in one of the most exciting cities in the world, San Francisco, California. But Susan was not happy. Moving to the big city was not so much a choice as it was a product of life and circumstance. Deep down, Susan had always been someone who preferred peace and quiet and being alone, things that were in rare supply in a big city like San Francisco. Many nights after work, Susan would come home to her apartment and she would sit there and dream about moving away from the city and living off the grid somewhere on a farm, raise her own food and be totally self-sufficient, away from everybody else in the world. And then one day in 1991, when Susan was 43 years old, she made that dream a reality. That year, she wound up purchasing a 20-acre farm located in a forest in a little town in Oregon called Weimar. However, this farm was really not a farm. There was nothing on it. There was no house for Susan to live in. There was no barn for her animals or tools. There was no running water, no electricity, no septic system. It was just pure Oregonian wilderness. But to Susan, it was perfect. The property kept her far away from other people, and she liked the idea of having to literally build her own farm. After all, she was an engineer by trade, so she actually knew how to build buildings efficiently and safely, and she was a big, strong, sturdy woman who was not afraid of manual labor. So when Susan finally arrived in Weimar and made her way up the winding dirt road through the forest and arrived in front of her property and looked out at the vast, rugged landscape for the first time, she was filled with a rush of excitement. Even though there was nothing on her 20 acres, it already felt like home. Over the next several months, Susan would transform these 20 acres into a neat little farm, complete with a big barn and a shack for her to live in, and a few animal pens for livestock. However, after the farm was built, Susan realized that building the farm was actually not the hard part. The hard part was maintaining the farm, going out there every day and doing all of her chores, feeding all the animals and doing all the different projects she had in mind. It was exhausting. And so not long after the farm was complete, Susan realized that as much as she wanted to be totally alone out there, she had to set that aside and hire some help. And so Susan printed out all of these help wanted flyers and put them all over town in Weimar, and before long, people began making their way up to her property to inquire about the role. Most of these applicants were people who struggled to find work elsewhere, either because they lived a sort of transient lifestyle, bouncing around from place to place so no one was ready to hire them long term, or because they had a criminal record and just straight up could not get a job. But Susan didn't care about either of those things. All she cared about was the people she hired would work hard and they would respect the peaceful, calm atmosphere she was fostering on her farm. Basically, do the work and leave me alone. And over the next 20 years, Susan would find dozens of people who were able to do just that. Most of them would work for Susan only for a short period of time. Others would stick around for a little bit longer, but eventually all of Susan's workers kind of rotated pretty quickly and moved on to other things. And when that happened, Susan would simply put up more help wanted flyers in town and hire more people. And in all the 20 years that Susan had been hiring these temporary workers at her farm, after they did move on and went somewhere else, Susan never heard about them again. However, that was about to change. On January 1st, 2014, Susan, who was 66 years old by this point, was outside of her shack out on her driveway when she happened to look up and see a car coming up her road. Now remember, she lives in the middle of nowhere. No one comes out to see her, so this is a very rare event. And so Susan is totally keyed in on this car. And this car, they pull into her driveway, and then out of the car popped 3 young people. It was 2 young men and 1 young woman. And before Susan could even ask them who they were or why they were here, they were telling her. They said they were looking for their father, Robert Haney, who at one point had told them he was working on Susan's farm in exchange for a little cash, and also Susan was letting him park his camper on her property, and he was living in that camper. The kids said their father always checked in with them at least once every couple of months, but they had just gone this really long stretch without hearing from him, and since he didn't have a cell phone and no permanent address, they had no real way of getting in touch with him, and so they were out there looking for him to make sure he was okay. And so they asked Susan, "Do you remember our dad, Robert? And if so, do you know where he is?" Even though this whole situation was totally surprising for Susan because she almost never got visitors, so that alone was kind of jarring for her. But when she heard the kids say their dad's name, Robert Haney, she immediately knew who that was. Susan told them that she had hired their father the previous spring to help build a structure on her farm, and initially, Robert was really nice to have around the farm. He worked really hard, he kept to himself, he was quiet, and he had a dog that was really friendly and loving. But in August of the previous year, so 5 months into Robert's employment on Susan's farm, Susan would tell them that their dad totally changed. He started drinking really heavily and not really working very much, and spending a lot of the day just kind of ranting and raving outside of his camper about how he wanted to exact his revenge on someone. Susan would eventually find out that what Robert was talking about is apparently one of his kids had been assaulted, and he felt very guilty that he had not been there to protect his child. And so the way Robert was handling this guilt was by drinking and thinking about getting his revenge on the attacker. Now, while Susan did understand why Robert felt the way he did and why he was kind of acting the way he was, it didn't change the fact that Robert's behavior had become very disruptive on her farm, and the one thing Susan really wanted was peace and quiet. And so she decided she would have to go confront Robert about his behavior and potentially fire him if he couldn't find a way to calm down. But before Susan ever had to do that, Robert one day just walked right up to her shack, he handed her an envelope filled with cash, and he asked Susan if she wouldn't mind looking after his dog for a while. And Susan was so taken aback by his complete change in behavior and this request that she just took the envelope and said, "Okay, I'll look after your dog." And then Robert nodded as thank you, he turned around, and he walked away from her. And then a few moments later, Susan's standing there with the envelope in hand, watching as Robert is climbing into some white car that had just pulled up in front of the property. She didn't know who was in the car with him, and then the car turned around and drove out of sight. Susan told the kids that that had happened back in September, so about 4 months ago, and since he left, she had not heard from him, despite the fact she still had his dog, and she told the kids that a lot of Robert's stuff was still in his camper. Susan brought the kids over to the side of her property where Robert's camper was, and when they went inside, sure enough, all their father's things were all over the place, but the one item that immediately stood out to them was their father's tool belt. They knew their father was a traveling handyman, that was how he made his living, and so it begged the question, why would he leave his tool belt here if he knew he was going to be gone for several months potentially? It didn't make any sense. After leaving Robert's camper, the kids thanked Susan and asked her to please be in touch if she learned anything else about their dad, and she said she would. And then the kids got back in their car and they began driving south towards the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. When they got there, they asked to file a missing person report for their dad. However, they learned very quickly that it was going to be very challenging to locate their dad, because their dad lived this transient lifestyle with no cell phone, he had no permanent address, he had nothing that could really be traced. But the investigators agreed with Robert's children that their dad's absence was a big concern, given the fact that his last interactions with Susan had consisted of him drinking very heavily and talking about going and getting his revenge on his child's attacker. And so the sheriff and the deputies were very concerned that that was exactly what Robert had done. He had gone out and potentially murdered someone and now was in hiding. So they asked Robert's kids if they could think of absolutely anything that could possibly allow investigators to track down Robert. And at some point, one of the kids said, "Oh, what about my dad's EBT card?" EBT cards, or electronic benefit transfer cards, are like debit cards for state welfare services. You can use the cards to buy things like groceries, and the cards are definitely traceable. A few days later, when Robert's EBT card trace came back, investigators saw the card had been used just 1 month earlier in a Walmart located about 30 minutes southwest of Susan's farm. Now, this trace obviously didn't tell investigators where Robert was right now or what kind of condition Robert was in, but they had no other leads to operate on, so they decided they would go to the Walmart and see what they could find. When they got there, the investigators were led to the back room of the building where they were able to review the security footage from the previous month when Robert was supposedly there with his EBT card. But after reviewing hours and hours and hours of footage, the investigators never saw Robert on camera. However, they did see Susan on camera, and unbelievably, she was the one using Robert's EBT card. And so obviously, this was very suspicious, and right away, the investigators left the Walmart, went back to their office, and began the process of getting a search warrant to search Susan's farm. Last night, I decided I wanted to treat my family to a nice homemade dessert. And so I headed to the grocery store and I picked up a trough of spoiled milk and a hammock of fermented herring, and then I headed home to blend the two together to create a nice frothy milkshake. But right before I hit blend, I got a notification on my phone that said I had just spent $2,000 on swearatawalrus.com. Now, I love to swear at a walrus as much as the next guy, but that website became so addicting for me. I was swearing at 50 walrus a night, and so I had to cancel that months ago. And so I knew that $2,000 charge could not be mine. Someone had stolen my credit card. But when I pulled out my 20-pound wallet, my credit card was still there. Well, it turns out the Dementor that was at the grocery store with me, who bumped into me as I was scooping up my spoiled milk, he wasn't just bumping into me, he was using his RFID scanner and scanning my wallet through my jeans and ripping off my credit card information. Yes, that's a real thing. People literally can scan your cards with a scanner through your pocket. Needless to say, after I discovered this, I canceled my credit card and I got a Ridge wallet. Ridge Wallet has a sleek and durable design, they can hold up to 12 cards, and most importantly, they are built with RFID blocking technology. So if you're like me and you're tired of Dementors stealing your credit card information with RFID scanners, then you need to get a Ridge Wallet too. Get the best offer for Ridge with my link, ridge.com/Mrballen, and save up to 40% through December 22nd. Again, that's ridge.com/Mrballen. A few days later, on January 10th, the sheriff and his deputies arrived at Susan's property, and when they pulled onto her driveway, Susan came outside to greet them. When she asked them, what's going on, they told her, hey, we're here to search your property in connection with Robert Haney's disappearance. And before Susan could ask any more questions, the sheriff said to her, hold on, just turn around, let's go back inside, I need to talk to you privately. And so Susan, who was very shocked by this, just said, okay, and she turned around and led the sheriff into her house while the other deputies fanned out across the property to begin this big search. Once inside of Susan's house, they sat down in her kitchen, and right away the sheriff says to Susan, okay, I have you on camera using Robert's EBT card. I know you stole it, so you need to tell me where Robert is right now, or it's going to get a whole lot worse for you. And as soon as he said this, Susan's look of shock on her face quickly turned into a look of kind of relief. It was like suddenly she understood what was going on here. And she says to the sheriff, no, I didn't steal his EBT card. He gave it to me along with an envelope full of cash when he left 4 months ago, and he told me to use it to buy dog food for his dog that I'm looking after. And since Robert had been gone for all these months, she had run out of cash to pay for the dog food and now was using the EBT card. Susan also added that if she had just stolen the card from Robert, she wouldn't be able to use it because it requires a PIN number, and Robert gave her the PIN number. That's how she was able to use it. The sheriff was not totally sold on Susan's story, and so he continued to ask more questions, trying to trip Susan up about how she came to acquire this card, but Susan was very firm that Robert had given her the card, and that was it. And so after several minutes, the sheriff realized that Susan was likely telling the truth, which meant the EBT card angle was likely a dead end, and they would have to call off the search. But as the sheriff was standing up to leave the kitchen and leave the property altogether, a deputy from outside came running into the kitchen and without saying a word, just bent down and whispered something into the sheriff's ear. And as the sheriff is listening to this deputy, his face is contorting in disgust. He can't believe what he's being told. And after the deputy stands up and leaves the kitchen, the sheriff takes a deep breath and then looks at Susan and says, "Ma'am, you're going to have to come with us." Back at the station, a now very flustered Susan was led into a small interrogation room where she sat down looking totally anxious. She's looking around, wondering what's going on. And then the sheriff walked into the room, immediately hit record on the camera, and then looked at Susan and says, "Has anyone died on your property?" The story that Susan would tell the sheriff that day in the interrogation room was so completely unexpected and horrific, it would make headlines all across the country. Before Susan began this story, she told the sheriff that everything she had said about Robert Haney's disappearance had been the truth. However, she had left one little detail out. After Robert had handed Susan that envelope full of cash and the EBT card, and then climbed into that stranger's car and driven away, after that, Robert had actually come back to her farm, and recently. Susan said she discovered his return when one morning she got up and she went outside to go feed her animals when she looked over at the pig pen and saw all the pigs who would normally be laying down and lounging around at that time of the day. They were all up and they had converged in one portion of the pig pen and they had kind of formed a circle around something on the ground, as if they were all trying to look at something on the ground. Now, Susan said this was totally uncharacteristic, so obviously something weird was going on, and so Susan dropped her food and rushed over to the fence. She climbed into the pig pen, and as she got closer and closer to all these pigs, she realized they weren't just looking at something on the ground, they were eating something on the ground. And so Susan goes right up to this ring of pigs, and she begins pulling them aside, and then right in the middle on the ground is Robert. He was laying on his back, and his insides had all been torn out. It was like the pigs were disemboweling him, and the most shocking thing is Robert was still alive. He was moving his arm and groaning. Susan tried to pull the pigs off of Robert, but she said they kept coming back and really aggressively continued to eat Robert. It was like they were in this feeding frenzy. And so Susan said, I thought about lifting him up and moving him, but Robert was practically split in two, and she felt like if she tried to move him, that would kill him anyways. And so Susan said she did the thing that she thought was right at the time. She left the pig pen, went into the barn, got a shotgun, ran back to the pig pen, raised the weapon, and fired it into Robert. Susan told the sheriff that this was purely an act of mercy. She was ending his suffering. After Robert was dead, Susan said she just left the pig pen, and then 3 days later, she went back into the pig pen with bags and collected the little bits of Robert that had not been eaten by her pigs. And then she took those bags of remains and chucked them into her barn on top of the trash pile. But clearly, Robert's remains had not remained in the barn because the thing that deputy had whispered into the sheriff's ear when the sheriff was talking to Susan in the kitchen was, "Sir, we found a leg outside." It was Robert's leg, and it was found not inside of the barn in the trash pile, but out in the middle of her property, just out in the open. Susan, when confronted with that information, suggested that, maybe a wild animal had gone into the barn, got a hold of it, and dragged it off. The sheriff didn't even know what follow-up questions to ask, and so he just said, "Well, why didn't you call 911 when you first saw Robert? I mean, maybe we could have saved him. Or at least after he was dead, why didn't you tell someone?" Susan would say that the reason she didn't tell anyone is she was afraid that if word got out about what her pigs had done, then her pigs would be euthanized and she would lose a major revenue stream because she sold her pigs' meat in town. And she said even if her pigs were not euthanized, she was worried people in town would not want to buy her pigs' meat after they learned her pigs were attacking and eating humans. Susan would tell the sheriff exactly where they could find the bags that contained Robert's remains, and she even said she would take a polygraph test to show she was now telling the whole truth. But when she actually sat down to take the polygraph test, she kept fidgeting and coughing and doing these really dramatic sighs, and it was causing the test operator to get really inaccurate readings. And so when this first polygraph test was over, the results were inconclusive. And so the investigators made Susan take another test, but again, she continued to fidget and yawn. And so finally, the investigators in the room watching this happen just called off the test. And when they did, they said to Susan, hey, we're going to search your farm, and if there is anything on your farm that you have not told us about, you're going to be in serious trouble because we're going to find it. At this point, Susan kind of stopped fidgeting and she looked up at the investigators, and after a long pause, she reached out across the table and grabbed a piece of paper and a pen. She pulled it back and she began drawing something. And after a few seconds, it became pretty clear she was drawing a map of her farm. And after the map was all drawn out, she drew a big X in the middle of it and then slid the map back across the table to the investigators. And she said, if you go to that X, you'll find Stephen. And the investigators are like, who's Stephen? We're talking about Robert. What are you talking about? Well, it would turn out Robert was not the only farmhand to die on Susan's property. In 2012, about a year before Susan hired Robert, she hired another man named Stephen Delacino. And according to Susan, Stephen was a lot like Robert. He was really easy to get along with, he was quiet, he worked hard. But at some point, Susan said they had a big falling out. Susan said she started to suspect that Stephen was stealing her guns in her barn, and so she went to confront him. And during this confrontation, they got into this big fight, and Susan said she didn't really remember all the details of what happened next, but at some point during this fight, a gun went off, and then Stephen fell to the ground in the middle of the pig pen with his head bleeding, and all of Susan's pigs suddenly swarmed him and began eating him. The stunned investigators again asked Susan, okay, if that really happened the way you said it did, why didn't you call 911 if this was like an accident? And Susan would say, again, that her big fear was her pigs would either be euthanized or word would get out that her pigs were eating people, and the people in town would not want to buy her pig's meat because of that. In the end, as far-fetched as Susan's stories were about what happened to Robert Haney and Stephen Delacino, there was never any evidence that actually contradicted her claims. And so as a result, when Susan went on trial for murdering Robert and Stephen, it came down to whether or not the jury believed Susan. And they didn't. Not at all. They believed that Susan was completely lying, and that in reality, Susan, who was known to have a very quick temper, shot Stephen and shot Robert very much on purpose, and then threw them into her pig pen. We can only hope they were dead before her pigs began eating them. On April 21st, 2015, more than a year after Robert's children had reported him missing, Susan was convicted of 2 counts of murder for Robert and for Stephen, and 2 counts of abusing a corpse. She was sentenced to a minimum of 50 years in prison. While in custody, Susan would be overheard saying there were 17 other bodies buried on her property. However, when the police went out there and searched again very extensively, they never found any other remains. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to make the like button a cup of coffee, but be sure it's full of coffee grounds. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We have a podcast that puts out brand new podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings, and on Thursday mornings, we put out the remastered audio of our best YouTube videos. The podcast is called the Mrballen Podcast, and it's available only on Amazon Music. Consider donating to our charity called the Mrballen Foundation that provides support for victims of violent crime and the victims' families. Monthly donors to the Mrballen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballen.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. We have 2 additional YouTube channels, Mrballen Shorts and Mrballen en Español. We put out near daily content on TikTok, Facebook, and Snapchat. Those pages are just called Mrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is @Mrballen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Check out our merch at shopmrballen.com, and if you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mrballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support, and until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.